Welcome to this talk on measuring student awareness of equality, diversity and inclusion, or EDI, in the chemical sciences. I'm Dylan Powell-Williams and this project was done with my colleague Kalku Karim. So the project started as an initiative to better integrate community building opportunities into the early stages of our chemical degree programme. And we started by hitting the literature and looking for other approaches that are being used to achieve the same goals. And this was kind of our shortlist. You can see the four approaches that we thought showed most potential for us at Leicester. So that's IBL, peer mentoring, peer-assisted or developed learning, and team projects. We ended up going with inquiry-based learning. The reason we focused on inquiry-based learning is because we already had quite a lot of experience of using these approaches, and we thought we could adapt those quite effectively to the needs of a community building activity. So what we were looking for was something that would help improve student outcomes, something that would have a positive impact on student retention at the early stages of the programme, something that would enhance student satisfaction, and something that would instill a strong sense of belonging to help students feel part of the chemical learning community at the university at a very early stage. And the activity we designed was called Inspirational Chemists, and it took the form of a student-led poster conference activity. The students worked in teams to design, create, and present posters on their chemical inspirations. So the teams worked on posters that were based on individuals or groups of people who they found inspiring and that they thought would be good ways of selling the subject, essentially, good ambassadors for the subject to help use and engage the community about chemistry. So the process involved a little bit of individual research where students reflected on their own personal inspirations. They then came together as a team and held a discussion, and we'll talk a lot about that part of it in a second. And they were then moved into production and presentation of the poster itself. So the activity was facilitated. It took place over a 4-week period of time. At the start of that 4-week period, there are a few days for students to reflect on their own individual inspirations. They then come together as a team on day 4, so towards the end of week 1, to discuss all of the individual inspirations that the different team members had. They also discuss equality, diversity, and inclusion. They discuss EDI at that stage. I'll talk about how we do that in a second. Once they've had that discussion, they then choose which inspiration to focus their poster on, and they design a draft. In their second meeting, a week later, they review that draft and evaluate what work they need to do to finish the poster off. They then have some time, just over a week, to finish the poster off, and then they have to submit it, and then they have the conference at the end of week 4. So the peer discussion, I want to move back to that because that's a really important part. We facilitate and scaffold that peer discussion quite carefully, get students thinking about a number of different things. So we want to empower students to challenge inequalities in science. We want students to recognise where there are achievement or attainment or employment gaps between demographic groups, think about how that might have arisen, and think about what the community can do to respond to that in the future. We want students to identify with their inspirations so that they can celebrate their own cultures, and we want the conference to be an opportunity to celebrate other cultures as well, to recognise the strength and power in diversity and inclusion. We want students to recognise the fact that the origin of core chemical principles does not necessarily have that majority face that keeps reappearing over and over again in the pictures in the textbooks that they've been using. It's not always middle-class, middle-aged white men from a pretty comfortable background who some of them almost doing chemistry as a hobby in historical times. There is a lot of great chemistry that is being done by people all over the world from all different demographic groups. And we want students to recognise that and see that as a strength for the subject. We also want students to think about how best to communicate those their team findings. So the end product of their discussion about chemical inspirations, how are they going to communicate that to their peers? How are they potentially going to communicate that to the community? While we were doing this, we wanted to evaluate this by asking 2 questions. We wanted to know how effective students for different stages of their education were at raising their awareness of EDI in the subject. And secondly, we wanted to know specifically how successful this activity had been in raising their awareness in EDI and what specific facets of this activity that particularly worked for them. So for that first question, we asked them Likert statements. So we asked them to agree with two Likert statements that are structured in the same way. And the structure is stage of education is taught in a way that fails to recognize EDI in the subject. The two statements, first one is university chemistry, one is pre-university chemistry. And you can see where we asked about university chemistry, less than 1 in 5 of the respondents, of whom there were 72, less than 1 in 5 of them actually agreed with that statement that we were failing to recognize EDI in the subject. When we asked about pre-university chemistry, on the other hand, the majority of them agreed that it did fail to recognize EDI in the subject. 60.6% agreed with that. When we asked about the specific activity, when we asked about the inspirational chemist activity, we found that the majority of students, over 3/4 of them, researched an inspirational chemist that they could relate to for the poster activity. And like I said, we felt that was a very important goal, so it was very pleasing to see the majority of students agreeing with that statement. We asked students whether the problem was a good way of discussing diversity and inclusion in the subject with two different groups. So we asked them whether it was a good way of discussing it with staff and a good way of discussing it with students. And pleasingly, over 70% agreed it was a good way for both of those categories. However, there's quite a big difference between the two. It's only 71.8% agreement when discussing with staff, with an 87.5% agreement when discussing with students. And that could be down to the fact that the activity is very much peer-led. The majority of the discussions and the majority of time students are working on this project, they are working with their peers. They're not interacting with staff that whole time. It could also reflect a perceived barrier to communication with staff. It could be difficulty some students have challenging that established the way things are in the subject with people who they see in positions of authority, the teachers or the educators who are working with them. So that's quite an interesting finding. The activity improved my awareness of diversity and inclusion in chemistry. Well, 86.1% of the respondents agreed with that statement, which is in line with the response we saw on the previous slide when we asked a very similar question. So those were written up last year and published in Journal of Chemical Education. You can see the citation at the bottom of the slide if you're interested. So our key findings, our key take-home messages from this activity. First of all, it's a relatively simple approach that can be very effective in facilitating peer conversations on equality, diversity, and inclusion. So this could be a really nice, fun activity to run in the first year, and it's a really good way to get students starting to think about those EDI themes and what it means in chemistry. Because I know I've spoken to a lot of people who said it's quite challenging to integrate this into chemical teaching. This can be a really nice, rewarding way of doing it that is very much student-led. The posters that students created did an absolutely fantastic job of representing diversity and inclusion in the subject. So we saw some fantastic representation from a huge different number of demographic groups. And that was really pleasing to see. The students took that aspect of the problem very seriously. We can see from the responses to the Likert statements that the activity successfully raised student awareness of equality, diversity, and inclusion in the subject, which was really a positive outcome for us. We did pick up on the fact that there's this possible student perception that they are underexposed to EDI in pre-higher education chemistry. So that's quite an interesting finding and possibly something that may need some attention. And then the final important finding that we had from our project was that forms an integral part of our induction program. This is now fully embedded into our induction. It helps students form very strong social links at a very early part of their degree program, and it also initiates those really, really positive conversations about equality, diversity, and inclusion in the subject. There's an example of a student quote from our end of module evaluation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I believe we should have some time for questions now.